Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scan What Matters, our latest webinar. And we're going to learn how a 99.9% precision AI engine will improve your security stack. And, before we go into the actual webinar, let me present myself a little bit. My name is Alimna. I'm a Senior Director of Engineering here at OPSWAT. I've been with the company for quite a few years, and I'm also the General Manager of the office that we have in Romania. As for OPSWAT, what we do is that we protect the world's critical infrastructure. And I think that what's very interesting about OPSWAT, and hopefully you can go check our other webinars as well, is that we have a very large suite of products that will help you protect all the critical areas in your infrastructure. We go from things like kiosks, which help you with the data that you bring inside the network, all the way to MFT, to a secure storage solution where you can scan your S3 buckets, and a lot of other types of storages, to a secure software supply chain, Meta Defender Cloud, which works great with APIs, and a whole bunch of other cool and interesting products. So yeah, go and check out our other webinars. Okay, so let's start with our main presentation. We all know that if you want to scan for malicious files in a real world traffic, real enterprise traffic, you will basically have 99.9% of your traffic. It's already clean, right? So the files that you're scanning are most likely going to be clean, because what we typically see in an organization is, for example, I don't know, MFT transfers, right? You send from one user to the other. You have maybe external users that are going to send documents to you, or maybe some other types of files. You have ICAP proxies. You have, of course, email, right? There's no organization that doesn't have email, or even like cross-domain data transfer. And I think what all of these things have in common is the fact that, again, 99.9% of your traffic is clean, right? And what we like to say is that there's the security tax, right? And we're going to see in the next slides that there's times when there's a definite benefit to actually paying these tax, because you want to be super secure, and you want to be sure that nothing is going to get past you. But there's also situations where speed is also more important, right? And I think what we want to focus on in this webinar is just try to understand how we can actually get the 0.1% files that are malicious in a very quick and meaningful way, right? So if we go to the next slide, we see that latency, right, the delay is basically the cost of security, as I mentioned earlier. And there's various situations where this is going to matter, right? If it's banking, a financial institution, maybe an insurance company, and so on, you need to know that everything that you upload is going to be scanned, of course, but it's going to be done so in a very fast and smart way, right? So I know if you want to spend 2 minutes scanning a file, I think that's maybe going to be a problem, right? Maybe the wire transfer is going to get blocked. The SOC as well, right? It spends a lot of time just trying to clear out the alerts. So if you have a lot of time scanning, that's a lot of time that's added, and a lot of frustration maybe that's added to the SOC analysts. And on the other hand, if we're talking about customer portals, right, where users need to wait a lot of time for things to get scanned, I think that may cause friction, right? Usually, whenever you see a spinner that maybe shows that something is loading or something is working in the background, and that stays for more like 10 seconds, it feels like something is wrong, right? So you want to find a way to improve that experience. And this is where we want to have this sort of an intelligent triage, as we call it, right? And we know that there are things like defense, government, critical infrastructure, where there's compliance mandates, and it's very, very important that you scan everything. And even if it takes a little bit longer, that's fine, because everybody knows and understands it, because that is the norm, right? There is no stepping away from security, right? And the regulators care that nothing really moves without being examined in the pipeline, right? But there may also be other situations where the user experience is as well very important, right? And as I've mentioned, even 10 seconds can seem like a lifetime, right? So for that, we do need to find a better way, a different way of doing things. And as it says on the slide, right, the competitive advantage kind of lives in those milliseconds or maybe seconds that it takes for a file to be scanned. And just to maybe sum or wrap this up, I think that both mandates are like very, very important, and it really depends on the kind of industry, the kind of use case that you would have. And the obvious thing that we think about when you're talking about scanning is talking about AVs, right? And one way that we would be able to have this sped up is to basically have a new way of scanning, right? Because if we're looking at the traditional AVs, I think they are great, but they are going to work primarily if they have already seen that specific file, right? It's basically a most wanted list, meaning that they would have needed to seen that specific file before, and if they have seen it, then they can recognize it again, right? And I think this is where we kind of need something that goes a little bit more into understanding maybe patterns or intent rather than just trying to match something that I have seen previously, right? So I think this is where we would want to introduce our latest technology, which is called OPSWAT Predictive AI. This is a machine learning based engine that looks, as the slide says, on the DNA or the malicious intent of that file, right? We don't use signatures. We basically try to understand the patterns of known bad or known good files, how they look. And then based on that, we are doing the prediction if that file is going to be malicious or not. And we'll see later in the slides that of course, this is not necessarily a new narrative, but the way that we have tuned this specific AV is mostly in order to have a very low false positive or false negatives, right? So whenever we're going to have a verdict, what we want users to know is that we're going to be very, very sure that that verdict is accurate, right? And if we don't really know, then we prefer to say it's suspicious and then let it go throughout the rest of the pipeline rather than triggering one of the events. But before we go into that, I also want to talk a little bit about speed, because this is another aspect of our machine learning AV, where we wanted it to be as fast as possible to basically go into the file, extract the patterns or the information that's needed in order to make that decision as good and as fast as possible, and then just continue with that with a pipeline, so that we don't try to stop anything in their tracks. And what we can see here is that it takes under 15 milliseconds for a P file to get scanned, and you see that it really goes even into the P90s or maybe P99s. It really is like very, very fast, right? So for the P90, it's going to be probably under 20-25 milliseconds, maybe even faster than that. We have a good coverage also of the formats, and what I can tell you is that there's more that are on the way. And if you're going to watch this webinar in 2 or 3 months, there's definitely going to be a lot more files that are going to be supported by that specific time. And this is where the interesting part comes, right? Because we have basically built this engine in order to detect malware, and we have tuned it in order to have a very low false positive. But seeing exactly how good it was with the false positives, we thought, okay, let's try to maybe change the narrative a little bit. And what if we try to basically detect also clean files, right? And we're going to see in the next slides exactly how that happens. But I think before we really go into that, it's also very important to know that it's going to be available for you in all the deployments and the deployment types that we have, right? So if you want to try it out in cloud, in Meta Defender Cloud, for example, you can definitely opt for that, and we're going to do everything for you. We're going to do the scaling, and we're going to be sure that we stay within the SLAs that are agreed. If you need something on premise, right, you don't want anything to leave your own network, we can also do that. You can leverage it through Meta Defender Cloud, and with Meta Defender Cloud for all the other products that we have on premise in OPSWAT. And we put here zero connectivity because it actually works in air-gapped networks as well, right? We know that there are solutions where either if it's cloud or if it's going to be on premise, some of the other AVs will need to actually go into the cloud in order to check various things, right? The ones that we have don't really need any sort of connectivity. So everything that you need is basically boxed into one nice AV engine, and that's going to be enough, and it's going to be okay to work in all kinds of environments. Going back maybe a little bit to the other point that I've made regarding the precision, you will see that precision was actually a deliberate choice from us, right? And I'm saying this because what we have seen is that the majority of the machine learning security engines are actually optimized for recall. Recall basically means that they will fire for quite a lot of the files, right? So it's going to be firing for maybe almost all the files, but that comes also at a cost. And the cost that it comes with is actually the false positives, right? It's going to catch everything, but you're also going to get or false positives, and that means that maybe certain files are going to get blocked just because they didn't really look right, or maybe there's going to be a lot more alerts for the SOC, right? And usually when you even as a user, when you kind of see this, it's going to maybe erode some of the trust, right? Just imagine that you maybe try to upload a legitimate file, and then it's not going to let you because I don't know, there's some pattern there that's going to be identified as potentially malicious, right? And what we have done is to, again, reverse this narrative and then lower the false positive rate just as much as possible, just to get into that 0%, even if that means that maybe the recall is not going to be so big, right? And I think that where we want to be seen as really important is both in having a high confidence detection, right, where we are going to have files flagged as being malicious, and then users that can actually trust this, and whenever we say that this is infected, we know that it's going to be infected. But basically also to have the sort of high confidence clearance, as you said on the slides, right? And what this means is that actually we're going to have a different way of looking at the files, and instead of trying to find malicious files, we have kind of turned this upside down, and we want to find clear clean files, basically, right? And I think this is going to be important because if we try to find the clean files, and even if we don't find the 99.9% of the clean files, but we only find 40, 50, 30%, it doesn't really matter. It's still going to be a huge improvement. So using the same technique or technology behind the scenes, we were able to come up with two different ways of looking at things, right? And then for the clean files, what it's going to allow us is to maybe skip parts of the pipeline, right? Maybe, again, if you want to go into a fast mode, you will be able to jump directly to CDR, and then you still have that safety net because the CDR is going to be a preventive technology. And if really something happens and we actually have a false negative, the CDR is still going to catch it. If it's going to be suspicious, on the other hand, it's still going to go through Metascan and it's going to be able to scan everything. And I kind of like this slide because I think that in order for our users and customers to have trust to use the deflection engine, you kind of need to build that trust, right? And I think that the way that we build the trust is by seeing, as I mentioned, a very, very accurate engine when it comes to the detection part, an engine that it's very, very tuned for precision. And then with that, I think the customers are going to see that if we move that before Metascan and we just reverse the narrative, we're going to be looking for the clean files, but we have the same precision as we had with the detection engine. I think that trust is going to be definitely earned. And this is where I want to talk maybe a little bit more about that deflection use case that I've mentioned, right? And I think that there is basically a high confidence verdict, and the safety guarantee is the same behind every malicious verdict, right? It's going to be, as I mentioned, kind of anchored into the same precision, the precision bar. And if we're going to go to the next slide, just to reemphasize a few of the things that I've mentioned. First of all, I think that we are conservative by design, right? And we're going to be able to also play with that threshold just in case somebody wants or tolerates a little bit more false positives or false negatives. But the way that we tune it from our training is basically to be a little bit more conservative, right? We want to have the CDR as a backup, at least for the clean files, right? We want to have it there in the whole pipeline, and we also want it to also be triggered, then when it's actually needed, right? And what we can assure you is that our zero trust policy will not change, and I don't think that this is going to ever change, right? This is the basic principle on which we have actually built MetaDefender Cloud and MetaDefender Core and all of our other products, right? So we don't really take a step back from us, but I think what we want to do is to give you the option to basically find a high confidence engine that is going to speed up that pipeline, as we've mentioned, right? We want to for you to be sure that the ambiguous files are still going to go through the whole analysis stack. We want you to be sure that all of the files that are going through the pipeline are still going to end up with a verdict, right? So nothing really changes here. It's really not less of a scrutiny. I think it's just maybe a little bit of a different way of looking at the way that we can do the scanning. And I think one of the benefits that we would have for this is that if you go on the first slide, we saw that we have MFTs there, and then we have ICAP proxies and various other things like email. And we kind of know from experience that what usually happens is that whenever an office starts work, then is when you're going to see the peak, right? Because everybody turns on their computer, everybody wants to read the emails, everybody wants to see maybe what new files they have had delivered overnight in their maybe MFTs, and you got your notifications and so on. So that's when we know that it's going to be rush hour, it's going to be peak time, right? So I think this sort of a fast mode is going to allow basically our customers to have a more calm pipeline, as the slide says, right? What this actually means is that you're going to not see peaks that are going so high, but more of a well-distributed traffic. as I mentioned, every file will get the verdict, right? This is not really going to change, right? Deflection, it's only going to basically choose the route, and with our workflows, our conditional workflows, is going to be easier than ever to actually set these sort of things up, right? If we want to strictly look at the initial part of the processing pipeline, we have a very high confidence clean part where we want to detect that that we have a file that it's a non-clean file. And then if we still want to go to the pipeline, it's not going to go maybe to Metascan, but it's going to instead go to deep CDR. And you're still going to end up in the same spot, right? You're still going to have a file that has been sanitized. But if we look at the other files that we're not very sure, we're going to continue with scanning with up to 30 engines for the multi-scanning, depending if you're going into core or if you're going into cloud. You're still going to go through the deep CDR. You're still going to have like a full verdict before the delivery. So again, nothing really changes. And if there is any doubt, the file will take the longer route, right? We never want to guess that it's a clean file. We just want to be very sure and very accurate that it is a clean file. Okay, so I'm just trying to wrap things up in the next couple of slides. I think that like there's like two problems, right? And I think historically they may have been treated separately, right? The number one or the first problem would be maybe the detection gap, and for this, we have maybe some 0 days that are kind of slipping past some of the signatures, and then the second problem would be the latency gap, right? So you would have situations where files would maybe take a longer time to be scanned, and even if it's maybe a small file, if you're like in the rush hour and then you have a big queue of files that are waiting, you're still going to need to have longer scan times, right? And again, that's where our architecture kind of comes into play, and we take the latency and we take that detection gap and we try to split them into the two directions. And we want to offer you basically a very fast engine that's very precise, that has both a deflection and a detection use case. And then you can find either the 0 days, maybe that the signatures can't really find, or maybe you want to have just the clean files in order to speed up your pipeline. And yeah, I think with precision, we think that we're going to have basically more automation that you can do because you have more trust in the verdict, and we can have situations where there doesn't really need so much and need to be so much review from a human. We can let the pipeline automate more. And in the same time, you will get, your response in just a few milliseconds. And I think that if you want to get maybe a few things out of the webinar, I think the summary would basically say that if you want to try out to evaluate predictive Alimna AI, you will get a precision first engine. You're going to have a very, very low false positives rate, and we've seen situations where the actual false positive rate is actually way smaller than what we show on this slide, right? We want you to know that the 0 day gap is still going to be covered with our detection use case, right? And we're going to still be looking at that malicious intent, and we're going to want to understand exactly why there is a problem. And notice that it's written as 2 again, so it should have been number 3 there. But the deflection is going to also help you close that latency gap, right? So what we want you to know is that you're going to get an engine that's going to be fast, that's going to be accurate, basically, and that's still going to catch 0 days, and it's still going to look at the malicious intent. And with that, I would like to thank you. And if you want to, get starting to talk with us, you have a nice QR code there. Just scan it, and then we would be more than happy to start that conversation. Thank you.